Hello there everybody, my name is Bloomer Brown and welcome to episode 10 of KSP Retrograde, where today we join back up with our lunar exploration crew as they are carrying out final preparations for departure. Bob Kerman of course has taken special care to make sure that all of the science has been transferred to the lander because it would be really rather embarrassing to have come all this way and gather that science only to leave it behind on the surface. And so with our crew and science safely aboard the lander, it is time to hand over control to Valentina Kerman, who is going to try to find a way to get this back into orbit and rendezvous with the drive section. So yeah, at about this point I start to regret not trying to make use of the inclination that we arrived at the moon with, and ultimately I end up having to make a correction to the drive section and basically change its inclination so that it passes over the landing site, just to make the actual orbital rendezvous a little bit easier, which does of course mean that we are burning off some more liquid fuel and oxidizer, which we need to make the return journey to Kerbal. And yeah, it's probably getting debatable whether we are actually going to have enough fuel to complete the burn or not at this stage, which does sound like a terrible situation to be in, but I have of course overbuilt the reaction control system on the drive section, and so I should have more than enough monopropellant to make up the difference. The bigger risk of course is that we would run out of fuel on the lander, because as we saw when we were coming in, margins are a little bit tight on it, and we don't have any get out of jail free cards, so yeah, I'm happier to burn off a little bit of delta V on the drive section rather than leave us halfway into orbit or something like that, struggling to change inclination and meet up with that drive section. Anyway, yeah, thanks to that inclination change, it is a pretty much a standard affair in getting ourselves into orbit and getting onto a close approach with the drive section. Yeah, once in orbit we can start plotting out a burn that is going to bring us in pretty close to the lander. I think we actually get down to less than 100 meters in the end, and you can also see me doing a little bit of radial burning there, or is it anti-radial burning, in order to get this to happen at a specific time. And that is of course because the drive section is completely automated and we need line of sight with Kerbal in order to keep control of it. And conveniently enough, it also means that we get to do the rendezvous in the full light of day, which is always a little bit better for watching these kinds of things on YouTube. So we are at last getting down to less than 1 kilometer of distance, and basically just using the engine to slow our approach. Obviously there are no RCS thrusters on this lander stage, and much like the Apollo missions, we are going to use the RCS on the main drive section to actually handle the rendezvous. So once we get into a suitable distance, I can switch over, activate the RCS and start slowly making my way in. Now there is a slight problem with this in that the RCS thrusters are slightly misplaced with regard to the center of mass, and I did check everything in the VAB during construction, but the problem is I did that with full fuel tanks and never bothered to check if they were over the center of mass properly once the fuel tanks were emptied. And it does have the horrible tendency to slightly torque the vessel as I am translating. Luckily though, we are pretty well lined up and approaching pretty close to the target, so it is not much of a problem to get ourselves in and docked. And once we are docked, we can of course transfer what little fuel remains in the lander stage into our drive section. And fuel is running a little bit low, and yeah, I can tell you now that we will end up actually using some of the monopropellant to get ourselves back down and captured in the atmosphere. And as I finish tweaking out the maneuver, it does look like I should have enough fuel to get the job done, but that is unfortunately because I have forgotten to shut down the landing engine. And while I don't think it would actually light up while we are trying to make this burn, it is better to have it shut down all the same. So yes, after spending another cycle in orbit of the moon, we at last reach our burn, point ourselves in the correct direction, and expend what little fuel we have left, and basically finish rounding things off with the RCS, aiming of course to get ourselves down somewhere below around 30 kilometers, because that seems to work pretty well even when returning from the moon. So yes, getting down below 300 kilometers and taking a look at how much monoprop we have left, we can see that we are easily going to make our way home, and we finish off getting it down to a little bit over 29 kilometers. And once carbon starts to loom large in the windshield, Valentina has a go at sort of configuring this spacecraft for re-entry, decoupling the drive section, and at last revealing where I have been hiding the heat shield. So yes, this is going to be something of an unorthodox and slightly risky re-entry maneuver. So firstly, two of our Kerbals are going to be experiencing negative G's as we hit the atmosphere, which is, you know, not really ideal. The main concern, of course, is that yeah, we have essentially a, you know, sort of a large aerodynamic surface on the front of the spacecraft, which is going to probably want to flip us out and come in ass first, as opposed to with the heat shield pointed into the plasma. Yeah, now I think if I were to drop off the fairing that is covering what I am calling the service module, we may have a little bit less drag on that area of the spacecraft, and it might be a little bit easier to control. But I am worried about doing that, because that is all that is protecting our parachutes from any damage they might incur. Also included in the service module are the roundified monopropellant tanks that we were using to supply the spacecraft while it was doing its various maneuvers in orbit of the moon, and I have located them just behind the heat shield to kind of add a little bit of extra mass and try to, you know, kind of keep the center of mass forward a little bit to try and keep this thing balanced as we enter the atmosphere. Though as we hit 49 kilometers and as we are still doing over 3 kilometers per second, yeah, things start to heat up a little bit, and it actually looks as though the heat shield itself may be overheating, though I'm assuming it is something behind it. And yeah, already we are starting to torque just a little bit, and we see the little overheating gauges flare on and off on the spacecraft. Now, if we were coming back from sort of low carbon orbit, you know, flipping out might not exactly kill us, but I have a sneaking suspicion that coming back at 3 kilometers per second through the plasma like this, and you know, not having a heat shield would spell disaster for the entire spacecraft and also the crew. So yeah, Valentina really finds that she really has to struggle to control it. But after a couple of moments, we start to slow down to speeds that are a little bit more reasonable, getting down to less than 1 kilometer per second. The plasma dissipates and we get our signal back. And yes, at this point we can jettison that fairing and also remove the ballast that was those monopropellant tanks, and start getting ourselves ready for a landing, deploying our drogue chutes, and whoa, we start flipping out enduring massive G-forces as we do so. Yeah, this thing is not the most stable. It is, perfectly designed for use in a vacuum, but once you get into an atmosphere, it is a little bit tricky to control. And so yes, we are down to 13 kilometers, and yeah, we can jump back into time accelerated mode as we deploy our main parachutes. And I have to say, after spending so long in the vacuum of space, that it is actually quite a novelty, and I am kind of taken away by the beauty of the volumetric clouds that have been brought to this thanks to Boulder Co. and the graphics enhancement assembly mod pack, which does add quite a bit of visual interest to the game, something that I think is lacking, though I'm sure if clouds were added to the base game, people would be complaining that it would be harder to spot various features from orbit. Anyway, we are getting down to less than 100 meters, and we can drop out of time acceleration to find that we are still moving a little bit quicker than we would like. And as we hit the ground, our landing gear is converted into a puff of smoke, but we do manage to land safely, flipping over onto our side. And I decide that I should get somebody out to plant a flag to commemorate the occasion, but unfortunately the hatch is blocked, and the space sombrero that the lander is now wearing is preventing us from turning the spacecraft over. So we decouple that and get Valentina out to plant a flag to commemorate this monumentous return before recovering everybody back to the KSC. And upon recovery, we discover that we have unlocked 2,290 science from that mission. Science which will no doubt be used to unlock a whole host of new and exciting parts that will become part of future missions. And speaking of future missions, just after dawn we join Jebediah Kerman out on the runway, where he is at last happy to unveil the top secret project that he and Bill Kerman were working on while the others were out on the surface of the moon. And yes, while he is waiting for a green light to go on this thing, he decides to jump out and play a short round of golf. And yeah, it also appears that he has grown for himself a little bit of facial hair, which, yeah, I mean, I suppose it kind of suits him to some degree. I'm not entirely sure. So yes, this is of course an upgraded version of the Kerbal Aeroscience Explorer, which is of course the aircraft that Jebediah managed to crash on takeoff out in the desert a couple of episodes ago. And yeah, not one for giving up. Jebediah and Bill put their heads together and basically redesigned the aircraft, which did have some shortcomings, though following the update from 0.24, those shortcomings got a hell of a lot worse. So yes, basically we are running on 3 engines now, and we've also gotten some new science experiments courtesy of the science and research that came back from the surface of the moon. And with the atmospheric fluid spectrovariometer data burning through our electric charge as we transmit it back to the KSC much faster than we can actually accumulate electric charge, I decide to light up the engines and basically get ourselves airborne, though it does appear that the engines are also not capable of generating enough electricity to keep our batteries topped up. And yes, eventually Jebediah starts complaining that the aircon is starting to go out, and yeah, perhaps his oxygen pumps may be failing as well, but I think after a short time we should actually be okay. So I suppose this is something of a redemption mission for Jebediah Kerbal, because he is of course bound for the deserts of Kerbal once again. And yeah, we are just going to bank over to the west and track down a small desert biome that I actually discovered on our home continent, something that I wasn't actually aware existed. And yeah, he is basically going to try to grab up all of the science that he accidentally destroyed last time around. And yeah, we have some new scientific experiments to deploy out that way as well. So yes, it is well worth the journey. And speaking of new experiments, we finally managed to get that science transmitted and our electric charge starts to recover, and Jebediah once again has access to air conditioning, which is, you know, rather important, because we don't want him sweating all over the controls and making them slippery as he banks and attempts a descent into the hot and arid environment that is the desert. And so just coming in, and we make a rather quick touchdown and begin deactivating the engines, while once again transmitting some of the data from that new aero science experiment thing. I can never actually remember what it's called unless I have it written down in front of me, but ultimately it does end up depleting our batteries again, and we have to rely on the solar panels to slowly recharge us. So yeah, there is going to be a little bit of waiting around for Jebediah. And yeah, jumping forward in time just a little bit so that you don't have to sit through all of that, we do eventually get our electric charge up to a level that is, you know, somewhat satisfactory for Jeb, and we get him out to do whatever science he can on the surface, and also plant a flag to commemorate his victory, and you know, perhaps look to the future, at least the immediate future, and hopefully this time he will not end up botching the takeoff. And so, as we have been doing on all of the other biomes, we decide to get Jebediah out to get his golf club out and play a round. Unfortunately, he is already carrying some science, so we drop that out and try again. And once we board, I decide to try and burn all of the experiments that we haven't tried yet. Just basically to make sure that we do not miss out on an opportunity to grab some fresh data. And I think that is pretty much everything caught up on in the deserts, and so we can light the engines and begin throttling up to see if we can go for a takeoff. And yeah, a little bit of a wobble at the end, but a short sharp pull on the joystick brings us up into the air, and I can begin searching for the KSC. And unfortunately there is a little bit of cloud rolling in, which does make it rather difficult to pick out the mountains. But once I get myself pointed on the right vector, they start to come into view, and we can pull up a little bit higher just so that we clear them in this dense cloud cover. And yeah, once we start to approach the KSE, I start diving down out of the clouds. Visibility is rather poor, and unfortunately I do not have any runway markers out, and have basically been aiming towards the sort of surface science experiments package that I have deployed out close to the KSC. And even courageous ace pilot Jebediah Kerbal decides that it is probably better to bring ourselves out over the waters of Kerbal and come around for another pass at that one. So yes, the cloud cover isn't quite as bad from this angle, and yeah, I can actually pick out the runway pretty well, and so all I really have to do is, you know, make sure to reduce my speed nice and gradually and keep myself aligned up with the runway. and dropping out of time acceleration. We can see that Jebediah is of course using fine control for this, because it is really rather torquey, and yeah, I have actually yet to attempt flying this with the reaction wheels disabled, just to see how things actually go. And so yawing a little bit to get ourselves lined up roughly with the center. Our altitude is coming down below 30 meters. We are still moving a little bit fast, and end up making contact with ground at just over 30 meters per second, and almost wobble out of control there for a moment. Yeah, I think I may actually have the brakes enabled on the front wheel as well as the back wheels, and yeah, jamming them on does tend to destabilize the aircraft. And so with Jebediah safely back on the ground, all we really need to do is recover the vessel and see how much science he got. And we managed to pick up 31 science from that. Science which will no doubt be used in future missions. Missions that will of course happen in future episodes. Till then, I'm going to say thank you very much for tuning in. You have been watching Bloomer Brown on YouTube, and I will see you next time.